Hi there, this is Rachelle Mee-Chapman with Relig-ish, where we help you create right fit spiritual practices for yourself and your family. Today is another episode in our series on sex and faith. And we've been talking about some of the coping mechanisms and some of the tools you can have in your toolbox to help you recover your identity, your sexual identity, if you've been raised in a really conservative and restrictive religious or cultural background. If you'll look below, you'll see all the links to the entire series. Last week we talked a little bit about creating space for negative emotions, which is an important recovery tool. And today we're going to talk briefly about releasing shame. Now, releasing the shame that gets embedded in you when you are raised with a message of fear and shaming around your sensuality and your sexuality is probably the deepest work that people do when they're recovering from overly restrictive religious norms. And it actually often requires professional help to really get down through all the layers. But today I'm just going to give you 3 resources to begin to release and resist shame messages that you don't need to hold on to in your life. And the first one is just the very powerful tool of using your voice and saying, I do not receive that. So what happens is when you grow up in conservative settings is that you're taught a lot of things about your body, about your desires, about the people that you're attracted to and the way that you're attracted to them that are shaming. You're told that they're wrong when really most of the time they're quite natural. You're taught that they are sinful when really it's how you are wired to connect with people. And you're told that it is against your culture, your family's way of being, or your church's way of being. And that can get embedded really down deep. So when you're working on sort of recovering your own healthy sexual identity in a post-conservative setting, when those messages come to you, either literally from the mouths of people in your lives or metaphorically from the voice in your head, the critic in your head, you can just say to them, I do not receive that. I don't receive that judgment. I don't receive that as fact. I don't receive your opinion. And it creates sort of a spiritual, energetic, and psychological boundary between your own self and your own body and the opinions and energies of others. So the second thing that you can do is start to untangle the story and identify the storyteller. So if you say you feel attracted towards someone and the story that you're telling yourself is that it's bad to feel attracted to someone, not to act on it or to not act on it, but that just that attraction itself is negative, is bad, is sinful. Just stop for a minute and ask yourself, who is telling this story? Are you the author of that story, or is there some other voice in your head from way, way back that's writing that story? Once you identify who the author is of that story, you can shape the story. So if it's somebody else telling you the story, you can say, I do not receive that. Change the channel, turn that story off, and begin the work of blocking that false narrative. If it's you telling yourself that story, you can give yourself a reality check. Is this really the right story to be telling about this situation? Is there another way to understand my feelings, my impulses, my desires, other than the story that I'm writing right now around it? So thinking about who is telling the narrative and the shape of the narrative can be helpful. And finally, there's actually some really accessible, storied research that has been coming out the last few years around shame and releasing shame. And one of the most popular researchers around that right now is Brené Brown. If you haven't heard of her, her name is spelled Brene Brown. And her book, The Gift of Imperfection, is really good for beginning to think about why that voice is in your head telling you that you're broken and wrong and sinful all the time, and rewriting that to create space for failure, to create space for success, to create space for a new way of imagining yourself in the world. So Brene's book, The Gift of Imperfection, is really good. She also has an excellent book called I Thought It Was Just Me, and her newest book, Daring Greatly, and she's got a couple of really good TED Talks. Now, one thing that I do worry about with Brene is that she's such an encourager to vulnerability that sometimes she forgets to remind you that it's not wise to be equally vulnerable to everybody you encounter, and that some people deserve to hear your story of struggle with shame and your healing process with shame, and other people don't, because they're not safe people and they haven't earned your trust. So just keep that in mind as she encourages you to be vulnerable and share your story, that you get to choose who you share your story with, and that you should choose wisely. So those are 3 sort of very beginning steps of sort of pushing on that shame reaction a little bit and seeing if we can't reprogram the way we think about sex and sexuality to dial down unnecessary shame and dial up health and freedom. And the 3 things again are to use that statement, I do not receive this, to ask who is telling the story in your head and to consider rewriting the narrative, and then to begin to do some research around how shame works and the intersection between shame and vulnerability by maybe reading some of Brene's stuff or watching her TED Talk. So that's all I've got for you this week, and I will see you soon. Until we meet again, I hope that you will get curious, trust your gut, and whatever you do, live from a place of love. Amen. Amen.